Adeline pulled on the white dress that had been set out for her, hung on the wardrobe the night before. There was a fly buzzing around the room, driving her crazy. She found herself distracted from looking in the mirror by the fly, trying to find it in the room. Occasionally it buzzed past her, once it even bounced into the mirror, but she couldn't catch it. Her reflexes weren't quick. It wasn't her job to be quick after all. Her job, as she understood it at least for today, was to bend over and present herself to him to mate, to expose her neck for him to bite, and to murmur and moan in a way that made him feel good about himself. By tonight, this dress would be stained with blood, and that did finally give her pause and make her look in the mirror and forget about the fly for 3 seconds. Would she look different afterwards? Feel different? She'd be a woman finally, right? "Are you ready?" Catherine asked from the door. It was kind of Catherine to ask, but she'd always been the kindest of the servants. Adeline nodded and followed behind her, stopping in the foyer for her mother's inspection. "Make sure you don't crush your hair," her mother fussed. "Where's your necklace?" "I still have to wear it. Until he gives you something different to wear." Her mother frowned at her boldness. She flinched and bowed her head, waiting as Catherine ran to retrieve the necklace, the white choker with the silver medallion that announced her status as a protected Omega. It served as the warning to anyone and everyone that despite what they might want to do, they were not allowed to touch her. She was spoken for even without a mark or alphas sent yet. If they harassed her, there would be trouble. On the very rare occasion she was allowed to be around people anyway. She lifted her silky hair for Catherine to fasten the choker on, and then they were off, Adeline's things packed into the second car while she rode with her mother and father in the first. Her brother's mate was due with her first child any day now, and she knew her parents were annoyed to be half a world away from them, but it couldn't be helped. The mating had to be now, and there were some things, few as they might be, that even her parents didn't control. "You'll be back before the baby comes," Adeline offered, trying to provide reassurance. Her mother gave a short nod. "Indeed. As soon as you are received, we'll be off." "Oh. You won't stay the night at least?" "Fool girl," her father said, not even sparing a glance. "You don't need us. You'll be very busy with your new mate. He'll probably want pups right away, and it's your job to deliver on everything he wants." "I understand," she said, bobbing her head low. He did understand. She knew all about her role as an Omega. Her job was to make her Alpha happy, to take care of him, to cater to his every need. She'd been given lessons in everything: laundry, cooking, cleaning, personal hygiene, even male pleasure and anatomy. Though of course she herself had never been touched and was not allowed to touch herself either. She had to remain pure. For a little bit longer. The drive out to the pack leader's house was long. Though her understanding was that he often lived in the city to perform his duty as pack leader and one of the ruling members of the whole East Italian clan, a large portion of the pack lived further out, in the smaller town where there was space. But she didn't really know everything, like she didn't know where she'd live now. It didn't matter. She'd go where her Alpha told her. It was a beautiful drive, at least. She found herself admiring the country, the meadows, the forests, the quaint villages they drove through, but never empty, no streets abandoned. People everywhere, even just riding bikes along the side of the road. It was so different than where she'd grown up, that much was clear. Her family would be so far away from her now. Matteo was the pack leader's name. His estate was massive and beautiful, really like a castle. She stared in awe as the cars pulled around on the circular driveway, and she stepped from the car, only to shiver at the onslaught of alpha pheromones radiating around the place. More than one alpha, that was clear. She couldn't help it, her bones clattered in her skin and her stomach clenched in fear. Her parents didn't even need to teach her that this wasn't safe. Her instincts let her know that she was in danger here. Damn, she was scared. And she hated being scared, even though she felt like she'd lived most of her life in fear. She tried to walk the fine line of keeping her chin high with pride in her status but shrouded in modesty and demureness, listening obediently from the side as her parents spoke with Matteo and his wife. Her parents' Italian had never been remarkable, which she recognized now as she heard the fluid way the actual Italians spoke. She was only passingly looked at, then their whole party was led through the grand estate to a party in the backyard. She stepped quickly behind her mother, flushing at the number of faces suddenly turned towards them. There was a whole little picnic set up, tables with food laid out, some servants bustling around as people ate and drank. "What's this?" her father demanded, turning angrily to Matteo. His voice made her shiver in fear even without it aimed at her. Matteo gave them a cool stare and answered, "It's a welcome party." "Who are all these people?" Matteo's wife assured them. "I'll introduce you while Adeline is being inspected." Inspected? Adeline's stomach fluttered but she said nothing, leaving it to her parents to sort this out. "What do you mean inspected?" her mother asked. "You think we've been dishonest about her health?" "Of course not, however she is new to us and we need to understand her condition firsthand so that we're prepared no matter what comes," Matteo insisted. "We want to understand her health, her needs. She will be well taken care of here, of course. Her Alpha will see to it." Adeline shivered just at the mention. Her Alpha. Her gaze trailed around the backyard, testing if she could identify him. There were lots of Alphas here though, and it overwhelmed her, made her queasy and dizzy. Her father was the only Alpha she'd ever been around. She wanted to cling to her mother, but of course her mother stepped away as if sensing this need and wanting to rid her of it. "Very well. You'll find her perfectly intact and healthy," her mother assured them. "Dr. Bella?" Matteo called, and a woman with her hair in a bun and a smart, shiny watch hurried over. "You may do your examination." "Will anyone else be present?" Dr. Bella asked. "Mama," Adeline hoped, turning her eager look to her mother. But her mother had already turned away with Matteo's wife, accepting a flute of champagne, shaking hands with powerful people. "I can assist," Catherine offered from behind. Adeline failed to bite back the sob of relief. She turned hopeful, big eyes to her maid. And apparently this was accepted, because Catherine was allowed to follow her and Dr. Bella and another younger woman into the house. A servant led them to a sort of sitting room and then shut the door. "Please remove your clothing," Dr. Bella said as she walked to a metal tray with medical instruments laid out. Then with a tight-lipped smile she offered, "Would you like a robe?" Adeline shook her head, understanding she was supposed to be docile and obedient. Slowly she removed her dress, then the rest of her clothing, handing them to Catherine, who folded them neatly beside her sandals. Despite the calm tone in the room, Adeline felt exposed and vulnerable, crossing her arms over her chest as she shivered. "Sit on the sofa," Dr. Bella encouraged, her tone calm but clinical. "None of this will hurt, though it may feel a little uncomfortable. This examination is to ensure you're healthy and ready for the next step, including your reproductive health. It may be uncomfortable, but it is necessary. We need to ensure you're healthy and ready for your Alpha to make you today." Adeline nodded stiffly, unsure of what exactly they were looking for. But what choice did she have? Perhaps it was a good sign that they were prioritizing her health before the next step. Right? Most of the physical was unremarkable. Dr. Bella's hands were warm as they moved across her body, inspecting her throat, her posture, her spine, even her feet. Adeline shivered at the impersonal but firm touch, trying not to flinch. When it came time for the internal exam, however, her heart began to race. Heat flushed her cheeks and she trembled as her thoughts scrambled, Italian words jumbling in her head and slipping away. She didn't quite understand what was being said, but suddenly, Dr. Bella and her assistant were guiding her into position. They nudged her down into the corner of the sofa, and Adeline felt their hands firmly but carefully take hold of her knees, lifting them apart. The vulnerability hit her like a wave and her stomach churned with shame. Catherine stood behind her, a quiet presence, and Adeline was grateful for it. At least her maid couldn't see her shame on display. She shuddered, clenching her hands together, biting back the whimper of nerves rising in her throat. Do we have to do this?" she finally asked, her voice small, trembling. Her wide eyes stayed fixed on Dr. Bella as the doctor squeezed a clear lubricant onto a cold, metallic instrument. "There's nothing wrong with me," Adeline added quickly, desperation creeping into her tone. I've never been touched in any way there." Dr. Bella gave her a short, firm nod. "Yes, we must do this. It won't hurt. In fact, the stretch will be good for you. Alphas run large." "What?" Adeline's voice came out small, her confusion and fear sharpening into panic. "Keep your knees apart or we'll have to hold them," Dr. Bella warned briskly. Adeline tried to obey, but she couldn't stop trembling. The nerves was too much, and when Dr. Bella began, the sensation was overwhelming. The fear and discomfort made her eyes well with tears, but she stayed still, trying to endure. When Dr. Bella finally stepped back, she gave Adeline a curt nod of approval. "You're all done. Redress with her help," she said, gesturing to Catherine. Adeline let Catherine guide her, trembling hands fumbling with her clothes. She splashed cold water on her face, trying in vain to hide the evidence of her tears. Catherine fussed gently with her hair, but it didn't help. Adeline couldn't stop shaking, and she knew her mother would be displeased. She was supposed to handle everything with grace, but she had failed. A servant arrived to lead her and Catherine back out to the main room. Adeline's heart sank as she stepped into the scene. Dr. Bella stood in the center of an embarrassing crowd, speaking with clinical detachment. "I didn't see anything concerning," Dr. Bella announced, her tone matter-of-fact. "She seems healthy overall. If you're considering starting a family soon, there's nothing I observed that would stand in the way." Adeline's face burned with humiliation, her hands clenching tightly at her sides. She didn't dare look at anyone. Adeline's mother sidled up to her and hissed in the language of home, "Straighten up. It was just an examination. You look pathetic. And your mate will hurt a lot worse if you snivel like that." But Adeline couldn't even feel the sting of her mother's words. The embarrassment, the fear, the overwhelming scent of so many alphas, it was all too much. She really thought she was going to be sick. Her cheeks were flushed and her ears itched, and she kept her eyes down on the ground. Until Matteo said, "Do you wish to take her now? Or would you prefer to eat first?" Adeline looked up, startled at the realization that her alpha was here and she hadn't even known. She gasped, but got only the briefest glimpse of him before her mother hissed in her ear and she remembered herself. She dropped to her knees on the ground and bent forward, submitting as her first act. "Ah," the alpha said. "You don't need to." He crouched down in front of her, which was not the script, and startled her. She sat up with another gasp, only to realize he'd been going to touch her. She stared at his hand and then his face. He was beautiful. He was the most beautiful man she'd ever seen. Not that she'd really spent much time around men. But he was beautiful, and her stomach and heart would have started racing, she was sure of it, if she wasn't already so overwhelmed with fear. She'd been prepared for a big, macho, angry-looking alpha. Instead, this man looked confusing. His hair was dark and wavy and hung a bit over his eyes, a bit unkempt. His eyes were so big and soft and round. She would never have expected those eyes in an alpha. He was big, certainly, his shoulders sharp, and his suit jacket. But also not big. Sort of lean, she thought. And he had earrings in, dangly silver earrings, which was not a thing an alpha back home would ever do, wear any sort of jewelry. He wore a suit, very stylish, a blend of black and whites that fit him very flattering. and the hand that hovered in the air had visible tattoos. Impure marks on his body. But then he wasn't an Omega, his body was his own. She was. He looked her up and down, but she couldn't understand his expression. This was her mate. This was the man she'd spend her life serving. And he was not in any way what she'd expected. His features weren't sharp and angry, but sort of big and round and soft-looking. Was this really an alpha? But yes, she could smell it on him, sense it in the proximity of his body to hers. His face looked kind, but her body screamed at her, "Flee. I'm here to serve you," she murmured, ignoring the warning and dropping her gaze. He was an alpha. She needed to make a good impression. Her life was entirely in his hands. I'm Samuel," he told her. "I think you speak Italian well?" "Yes, I'm almost fluent," she assured him. Bit of a lie. Silence. She tried to ignore all the eyes on them. He hoped she was doing well. She'd prepared for this moment her whole life. She hadn't expected to find him so pretty. But the tattoos. Maybe he was one of those men who looked pretty but was actually terrifying. Calm in front of others but fierce when they needed to be. She'd heard Italian men could be like that. "Your name is Adeline," he said after a pause. She nodded. Her name sounded funny in his mouth, but she didn't react. You want to eat and talk first?" Behind her, her father said, "We'd prefer if you got on with it. We have a flight to catch. Our son's first child is due any day now." "Oh. She swallowed, anxious at her father arguing with her alpha. If they fought, she was supposed to side with her alpha now, right? "Yes." "Okay. Matteo." "Yes, of course. Lead them to the suite, please," Matteo called. Adeline's knees shook as she pushed herself to her feet. She didn't notice he'd put out a hand to help her up until she was already standing. "They don't need you," her mother said with a harsh laugh, and Adeline glanced back to see that Catherine had been going to follow. "Do you plan to hold their clothes for them?" Adeline saw the kind, encouraging smile Catherine gave her and tried to draw strength from it as she followed Samuel and a servant back into the house. The suite they were led to was a different one, up on the second floor this time. The whole estate was incredible, and Adeline tried to let the beauty of the house distract her. It didn't work. The servant closed the door behind them, leaving her alone with her alpha. Samuel had been walking ahead of her and turned at the noise. And the moment was just too overwhelming. Adeline dropped to her knees, feeling like her heart was going to pound out of her chest. Hey." Samuel moved closer, hesitated for a moment, then crouched in front of her. "Are you okay?" Adeline looked up at him and nodded, but his expression told her he wasn't convinced. "Are you just afraid?" he asked softly. Her stomach tightened. What was the right answer? Was it better to say yes? Or no? "You're making me kind of nervous too," he admitted, a crooked grin tugging at his lips. It was small, but it seemed genuine. "You're a lot prettier than I expected." The unexpected flattery rolled over her like a warm blanket, melting some of the icy tension in her chest. She had the briefest flicker of calm. He thought she was pretty. That was good, right? She flushed harder, her cheeks burning, and tucked her hair behind her ear, her gaze dropping to the carpet. "You're prettier than I expected too," she murmured. He actually chuckled, a quiet, slightly awkward sound, and somehow it soothed her even more. "I was a little afraid they'd say we had to. Do it in front of them," he sighed, sitting down fully, his legs crossing as he leaned back slightly. Well, you should know they're going to check afterward. To make sure we did it. And they'll want to see the bite." He glanced away, scratching the back of his neck. "I already thought about faking it." "Faking it?" she repeated, startled enough to look at him. "Yeah," he admitted, his voice low. "Saying we did it but not really doing it." "Oh." Nausea churned in her stomach, rising to her throat like bile. She swallowed hard. You don't want me. What can I change? What? No. His brown eyes widened puppy-like and full of panic. I mean, you don't need to change anything. It's not that. We don't really know each other. And I don't want to, do the tango with someone who doesn't want it. Damn. I want it, she blurted, realizing too late how badly she'd misstepped. She hadn't made him feel like she really wanted this. Like she submitted. She swallowed hard, leaning forward just enough to close the distance between them. Her voice was softer, steadier this time. Please. I do want it. His eyes widened comically large and he seemed to freeze, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed. He stammered, clearly flustered. It wasn't very alpha-like behavior. I do want it, she repeated, her tone firm now. I want to be yours. Please make me yours. The words felt ridiculous leaving her mouth, and she had to fight the urge to roll her eyes at herself. You've been trained for this day for years. But the fear had muddled everything in her mind, leaving her grasping for composure. Even leaning closer just enough to catch the alpha pheromones rolling off him, made her body betray her. She shivered and shook, her instincts torn in two, one part screaming at her to run away, the other pulling her toward him with an inexplicable need. His mouth twitched, his expression caught somewhere between an uncertain smile and something more serious. That's better, I guess, he said, his voice rough. You're okay with this? Yes, she insisted quickly. It's just. He hesitated, watching her carefully. You're shaking so hard I can hear your teeth chattering. I've never been touched, she reminded him softly, her voice trembling. I'm just nervous and excited. I've been waiting for your touch for 20 years. Samuel blinked at her, his eyes widening as though she'd said something remarkable. This time he actually licked his lips, his gaze flickering over her face. I don't. To be honest, what can I do to help you? Want me to? She asked hesitantly. It's not that, he assured her quickly. It's just a lot of pressure, you know. She waited, unsure how to respond to that. Pressure? He was an alpha. What did he care about pressure? You don't want to claim me? She asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. He made a low, groaning noise she couldn't quite interpret and turned away from her. The action sent a fresh wave of fear crashing over her. He's rejecting me. Adeline froze, unsure of what to do. Would begging be better? Or should she try to act aloof? She'd read about moments like this, about what to expect, what she might need to do, but imagining it and living it were two entirely different things. The weight of her inexperience pressed down on her. What if she made mistakes? What if she did everything wrong? She'd never even seen a man's body in person before, let alone known how to respond to one. Was this a test? Was he waiting for her to prove her submission? Her trembling fingers moved before her thoughts could catch up. Slowly she stood and pulled her dress over her head, the fabric pooling at her feet. Samuel turned around just as she reached for the clasp of her undergarments. His face went slack as his eyes locked on her, his expression unreadable. Adeline's breath hitched. The intensity of his gaze made her feel even more bare, as though her very essence stood exposed before him, trembling and waiting for his judgment. She shivered, teeth chattering as her bra slipped from her fingers and fell to the floor. You're beautiful, she reminded herself, repeating Catherine's words in her mind like a mantra. There's nothing to be ashamed of. But his silence and the blank look on his face were impossible to decipher. His eyes trailed over her body, her chest, her stomach, her shoulders, and she felt heat crawl across her skin, unsure if it was shame or something else entirely. With shaky hands she hooked her fingers into the waistband of her panties and slid them down, stepping out of them carefully and letting them fall to the floor. She stood there, completely bare, feeling more exposed and vulnerable than ever in her life. He groaned, turning away from her and collapsing onto the couch, pressing his face into the cushions. "Damn," he huffed, his voice muffled. "The way you smell." "It's bad," she gasped, her heart dropping. "No," he said sharply, lifting his head, his breaths coming heavily. Look, I'm trying to be polite because we just met, but why did you take your clothes off? You're making this way too hard. Here's a revised version that maintains the emotional tension and intimacy without being explicit, which would make it more suitable for YouTube. You want me to put them back on?" she asked hesitantly, voice trembling slightly. "No." His response was sharp, almost urgent, as he turned to face her fully. His expression was filled with frustration. "I want you," he admitted, his voice low and rough. "But I'm trying to take this slow. I don't want to overwhelm you." Her uncertainty deepened. She stood there, biting her lip, her eyes searching his for some sign of reassurance. The tension in the room felt thick, and she wasn't sure if she was doing anything right. She heard him release a low, almost frustrated sigh as he leaned back against the couch, his hands gripping the cushions tightly as if to keep himself composed. "What do you want me to do?" she asked softly, her voice shaky but sincere. He let out a breath, his body tense, and the silence stretched out between them. Her heart beat faster, unsure of where this would go. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to steady her nerves. "Alpha." His gaze flickered between frustration and something else, something more intense, as his body seemed to vibrate with restrained energy. "Damn," he muttered. His voice was raw, almost desperate, as he tried to regain control of himself. "I'm trying really hard not to rush this." Her mind raced, her body unsure of how to react to the tension building in the room. She knew this moment was significant, knew that her response mattered. She wanted to be sure, but the anxiety of the unknown pressed in on her. "Please, just tell me what to do," she whispered, her voice quivering. "I'm ready." He inhaled sharply, his gaze now steady, though still filled with a restrained intensity. "Do you submit to me?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. "Do you consent to this? I need to know, because I won't do anything you're not ready for." Her heart fluttered in her chest, but her voice was clear, her resolve strengthening. "I submit. I consent. Just lead me, Alpha." He was behind her in an instant, his body pressing her firmly against the back of the couch. Her heart raced, pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. The warmth of his chest against her back sent shivers down her spine, and she froze, unsure how to react to the sudden closeness. For 20 years, she had gone without touch, without the closeness of another person, and now his presence unraveled something deep within her. She wasn't sure if it was fear, longing, or something in between, but tears pricked her eyes all the same. "Why do you smell like this?" he murmured, his breath hot against her neck. The question was rough, urgent, but his voice sent a shiver coursing through her. Her whimper slipped out before she could stop it, the sound startling even her. There was an intensity to the way he held her, his grip firm, his closeness intoxicating, and she didn't know how to feel. Part of her wanted to lean into it, to let herself get lost in his warmth. But then something shifted. His movements became more insistent, and suddenly, a sharp, jarring ache swept through her, leaving her gasping. Her fingers gripped the edge of the couch as she tried to steady herself, her breaths coming quick and shallow. The weight of him pressed deeper, and the realization of what was happening sent her mind spiraling. Pain and confusion tangled together, each sensation leaving her uncertain. She could feel his voice vibrating against her skin, low and urgent, though her mind was struggling to keep up. His words, a mix of need and satisfaction, were distant echoes as her body trembled with each passing second. She could do this. It didn't feel the best, but it was bearable. Even through the rawness in his voice, there was a soothing undertone to it. His words, flattering and steady, calmed her. A shiver ran across her skin, goosebumps rising as she sensed his approval. She could handle this. It would be over soon. But it wasn't over. His movements quickened, more intense this time. She braced herself, surprised by the speed at which he moved. The sting faded with time, but her body was still tense, reacting to every motion. The pressure of it left her breathless, holding onto the couch to steady herself. Though the discomfort eased, her body remained on edge, each movement sharp and demanding. She focused on keeping her composure as he continued, his touch firm, persistent, guiding her through the storm. Her mind spun, thoughts tangled in a whirlwind of emotions, fear, uncertainty, and an unexpected determination. His breath lingered close, the weight of him pressing her deeper into the couch. She kept telling herself it would end soon, that she just had to get through this. The sensation of his hands on her hips made her body tense, her muscles resisting, but she clung to the thought that she could endure, that she was pushing through. Her chest tightened, the air growing heavier, and she felt lightheaded, her breaths shallow. She focused on staying present, trying to ground herself in the moment. This was something she never imagined happening, and though it wasn't exactly what she'd expected, a part of her felt a strange sense of pride. She was doing this, living through something she had only ever wondered about, and that thought anchored her as her mind raced. And then he marked her. His teeth pressed into the delicate curve of her neck and shoulder. She cried out, struggling against the overwhelming sensation. His grip tightened around her as the pain flared, a sharp, unbearable sting. Blood trickled from the mark, and she winced, feeling the weight of the moment as it lingered. At first, the discomfort was all she could focus on, but slowly the sharpness dulled, and all that remained was the weight of the moment. He went still, his chest pressing against her back, the force of his breath rushing out in ragged gasps. The connection between them felt different, deeper, as her mind hazily understood what had happened. His body tensed with the pressure of the bond, and his breath grew heavy and strained. The tension stretched on, but then with one final shift it eased. He held her close, his presence a solid weight against her, the bite still marking her skin. The door to the bedroom suddenly opened. Adeline gasped and clapped her hands around her chest. But Samuel turned to the door, snarling, "Get out!" It was her parents. Before he could say anything else, her mother laughed. "Oh, maybe you're an alpha after all." "You're marked?" her father asked, striding over to her as if she was naked and bloody just for fun. "Ah, good man. Your brother called. Emily's in labor, so we're heading out now to try and make it home in time. I'll never forgive myself if I'm not back when that baby is born," her mother let her know. Adeline just stared. "Well, bye, sweetheart. Air kisses. You're filthy right now." "You're going?" she asked. "Yes. We love you. Goodbye." Her parents both mimed kisses in the air, absurd and ridiculous and not something they'd ever done. A show for Samuel? That seemed strange. He thought it was strange too and just stared at them from the side as they turned. "Mama?" Adeline called. She knew her mother had heard her. But she didn't even stop at the door, just breezed out. And left her there. For a few minutes they just remained frozen in the room. It felt like an eternity. A liquid reminder ran down her legs and she shuddered at the warmness. "Can I shower?" she asked him. "Oh, yeah. Through there," he pointed towards an ensuite bathroom. "I'll, give you some privacy." He left the room without another glance. Adeline cried for a long time before she could bring herself to move. Her parents' departure had been so abrupt, so cold. It felt like a final severing of any bond they had left. Their indifference stung more than she wanted to admit, and as she stood in the bathroom staring at her tear-streaked reflection, she couldn't help but curse the traditions that had brought her here. Werewolf customs, with all their rigid rules and unfeeling rituals, had stolen so much from her. But as she wiped her face and steadied herself, she clung to one small thread of hope: her new mate. Samuel was unlike anyone she'd imagined, a far cry from the harsh, domineering alpha she'd prepared for. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't all bad. Perhaps this new life, away from her parents' shadow, could offer her the chance to find something she'd never had: a real family. Adeline wrapped her arms around herself, her voice barely above a whisper as she murmured to her reflection, "I hope the future is kinder." And for the first time in years she allowed herself to believe it might be.
And that concludes the end of the story. I appreciate feedbacks. Thank you for listening and see you on the next one. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more.